I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. I've got some stress, alright? Health psychology is a field of psychology that uses behavioral principles to prevent illness and death and to promote health. It uses what we call behavioral medicine, and that's just the application of psychology to manage medical problems like asthma or diabetes. Now, one of the most talked about and researched fields of health psychology is on what we call lifestyle diseases, and those are just diseases that we know are related to health-damaging personal habits like strokes or lung cancer. Now, people are at different levels of risk when it comes to these kinds of medical issues. There's certain kinds of behavioral risk factors. These are actions that will increase your chances of these kinds of diseases or injury or premature death. So I'm sure you already are fully aware that certain behaviors are much more risky than others, such as smoking. That increases your risk of getting lung cancer, and alcohol abuse, drug abuse, poor diet, insufficient exercise, risky sexual practices, and so on. The list goes on, but the whole idea is some people have more of these behavioral risk factors than others, and as a result, they are at higher level of risk of becoming sick or injured. Some people, in fact, have what we call a disease-prone personality, and that just means these kinds of risk factors, like certain kinds of risk factors, seem to be more or less integrated into who they feel that they are. So this would be a personality type that is strongly associated with having poor health. And the result is that a person with this personality tends to be chronically sick and depressed and anxious, perhaps even hostile. It's not a good way to live, but unfortunately many people have this kind of personality. What we're trying to accomplish in life, what health psychology is all about, is overcoming these problems, trying to correct these problems using behavioral principles and things like this. What we're trying to achieve is called wellness. Now, wellness doesn't simply mean that you are physically healthy. It also means that you are in a positive state of mind. You are psychologically healthy. So people who are well, we would say, are happy, they're optimistic, they're self-confident, and they can bounce back from emotional problems. This brings us to the risk and resilience model. So the whole idea of this model is that it's definitely a balancing act between these risk factors I was just talking about and the resilience factors that people have, or you could call them protective factors. And the whole idea here is that in order to determine how likely you are to suffer from these risk factors, we need to weigh them against the protectives. So, for example, if you eat lots of junk food and you really love to eat junk food, that's a pretty big risk factor for many kinds of diseases. But if you also get tons and tons of exercise and you're always working out, that might balance the equation, that might balance the scales. And as a result, you're not really at much risk, even though somebody else who eats as much junk food as you do would be at much higher risk because they don't have those same protective factors. Stress is a psychological and physiological response to a condition that threatens or challenges. So this definitely has a lot to do with emotions, which is what we were talking about in the previous video. Remember, with emotions, emotions are tied to motivation, and emotions are all about kind of kicking us into gear and getting us to do things when we need to do them. This is definitely the case with emotions like anger or fear, and those definitely play a major role in stress. So when you feel stressed, that's going to engage the same kinds of processes. So, your autonomic nervous system is going to kick into gear, your sympathetic branch is going to start ramping up, your heart rate's going to increase, your breathing rate's going to increase, you'll start sweating and so on. It's the same exact process with stress. But the thing that's interesting about stress is it can definitely be caused by unpleasant events, like, if your boss gives you a hard time, or maybe you get fired or something like that. But stress can also be caused by pleasant things, things that you would normally not associate with anger or fear, like getting a new job, or maybe even winning the lottery. This can be a very stressful thing. If you never really thought about it, this eustress, this stress from pleasant events, it can be pretty serious. Just imagine what it would be like if you won the lottery. I mean, yeah, it's great. You got a whole bunch of money, right? But now you have to think about what you're going to do with it, how you're going to invest it, what should you buy, and you're going to start having to, price comparison, all these different things. It's just, there's so much, choices that come along with that great event that has happened to you. And as we talked about in a previous video, choice can produce sometimes overwhelming amounts of stress. So I have a really cool video talking all about what stress is in the comments down below. So make sure you definitely check out that video. It's a really good video. As you'll see in the video, a stressor is anything that can produce stress. Now, for most of us, especially in this country, stressors tend to be rather mundane. Like, you got an fender bender, or maybe you spilled milk, or your baby started crying, or something like that. These things, they can be very stressful, but it's not really life-threatening. So it doesn't really make much sense when your stress response kicks into gear and you start feeling those intense kind of anger or fear emotions. Like, it doesn't really make any sense to get angry when somebody bumps your fender. Yeah, it sucks, but it's not like you need a fight for survival here. So it's kind of interesting that we have that exact same stress response to these kind of mundane things that other people would have to actual fear, producing stimuli, like being attacked by a bear. So whether you're being attacked by a bear or whether you spilled milk, it's going to be the exact same kind of stress response. And the thing about that is, we feel stress. We feel these, kinds of stress responses all the time. Like, our world is full of stressors, and it definitely does a lot of damage over the long run to our systems. I just mentioned that choice can produce a lot of stress. Remember the paradox of choice. Having too many choices can be overwhelming. Well, this is definitely the case when you're in some kind of a conflict. So when you're in a conflict, I would say that's like a stressful condition where you have to choose. You have to make some kind of a choice between contradictory needs, desires, motives, or demands. So what you're going to do whenever you're put into a state of conflict is you're going to have to just look at all your different options and kind of do a cost-benefit analysis, so you're going to be weighing their desirable qualities against their undesirable qualities. So you're looking for which choice has the greatest approach features and the least avoidance features. If you do experience a conflict like this and you have to weigh all the different choices, here's a few words of advice. First of all, just if you can take your time, take your time very carefully and at great length, and just make sure you're making the right decision by doing this kind of cost-benefit analysis. Secondly, if you have the option to do so, you should try out the different options to see if they work for you, or maybe they just aren't, really what you thought they were. Third one is look for compromise between the different choices. Like, maybe you don't realize that there's actually more choices out there. Like, you could do half of one option and half of another option, or something like that. And then finally, and this is the best word of advice I can give you whenever it comes to making any kind of important decision, is just, if at the end, when you make your decision, just live with it. Don't second guess yourself. Don't ask yourself, what if I picked this other option? Maybe I would have been happier. Because you can't go back in time. You can't change the decisions you've already made. So all you're doing by second guessing yourself and asking questions like this is you're just making yourself miserable. So just don't put yourself through all that, garbage. Frustration is different. Frustration is not really the same thing as stress. Frustration is more so a negative emotional state that occurs when somebody is being prevented from reaching their goals. I can give you all kinds of examples of this, but just imagine that you are literally trying to get somewhere, like you are trying to walk from point A to point B on campus, and some annoying kind of salesman or some annoying kind of poll taker or somebody just kind of intercepts you, and they literally prevent you from moving. Like they are trying to talk to you, but you don't want to talk to them. You have to get to class or something like that. It can be extremely frustrating when people just won't get out of your way. You might actually start wanting to get violent with this person because they are literally, frustrating the crap out of you. So that example would be a kind of external frustration where there's something in the environment that is literally holding you back. But some sources of frustration are more so internal. They're personal sources of frustration. So these are when you're being prevented from reaching your goal because of like character flaws or personality problems or something like that. Like if your goal is to get straight A's in all your classes, but you can't seem to bring yourself to study enough, like you can't force yourself to sit down and read over the material and study, you could become very frustrated with yourself. You could start asking yourself, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just do what I need to do? And that can be extremely frustrating. As I just mentioned, we react to frustration primarily through violence, aggression. So aggression, that just refers to any kind of behavioral response to a person usually, or maybe an animal or an object, just whatever it is that's frustrating you, you're going to likely lash out against. You're going to start throwing punches or something like that. Now, when it comes to aggression though, oftentimes the thing that's frustrating us isn't really a good thing to pick a fight with. Like if your parents, let's say you're like my son and you're 3 years old. If you're a 3-year-old and your parents are frustrating you, you probably shouldn't start throwing punches because that's probably not going to end well for you. So instead, what happens in these kinds of cases is called displaced aggression, where the child will redirect their aggression towards a different target, a target that's generally considered more safe, like maybe a little sister or a stuffed animal or something like that. Like they're just taking out their frustration, they're taking out their aggression on a safe target. And sometimes this displaced aggression can involve scapegoating. So that's where you would literally blame somebody else for your current frustration. So you're blaming somebody else for something that they did not do. So aggression is the primary way people react to frustration. But there is another way, and that is escape. So when I say escape, I mean all different kinds of escape. So I could mean literal escape, like you're leaving the situation. You're just leaving this kind of frustrating circumstance. Like if you're frustrated with your performance in school, you could literally drop out of school. That would get you out of this frustrating circumstance. Or you could escape in a more psychological sense, where you continue doing what you're already doing, but you fall into a state of like apathy. Like you pretend like you don't care. You pretend like you're not even there, pretty much. So this kind of apathy, this kind of psychological escape, comes in two common forms. You have like a kind of a pseudo apathy, where you just kind of act like you don't care, but in reality you really do. And then the other primary way is through the use of psychoactive drugs. So when people are really frustrated, they can, escape by doing various drugs, like marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, or whatever, even though it provides only a very temporary sensation of escape. A lot of the times people do fall into these kinds of, habits. So these would be examples of ineffective, like extremely short-sighted, kind of emotion-focused coping with a frustrating circumstance. And this definitely brings us to the concept of learned helplessness. Now, I briefly touched on this idea of learned helplessness before, but this is based on the research of Martin Seligman. And this is just referring to the idea that we can learn to give up. We can learn to become unable to overcome obstacles and avoid aversive stimuli. We sometimes call this learned passivity, because the animal just basically learns to accept this, frustration, accept this pain, or whatever it is they're being subjected to. So this will occur primarily when the animal feels like they don't have control. Here's a demonstration. So, as you can see here, we have a little doggy in a chamber that looks a bit like this. So, when we apply a painful shock to one side of this little chamber, the dog will escape. That makes sense. The dog doesn't want to stick around if he's being shocked. So he'll jump over the barrier and escape. So the dog knows he can get over that barrier. But then, after he's learned to escape, we change the situation. So we extend that barrier all the way to the roof, so now the dog there's no way he can possibly escape. However, when you apply an electrical shock now, he'll still try to escape because he already learned to. In fact, you don't even need to teach him to escape in the first place. He'll just instinctively try to get away. It makes sense, if you're being shocked, you should try to get out of it. But he will learn, relatively quickly that there's nothing he can do. At that point, he'll basically just kind of give up. He'll lay down and just accept the pain, because obviously if you can't get away from it, you shouldn't try. It makes perfect sense. In fact, the more intelligent the animal it is, the quicker it will learn to give up. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what happens when we reset the barrier to how it was in the beginning. So now the dog can escape. Remember, he's jumped over this before. He probably remembers jumping over it before. He's done this, right? But he'll continue to give up. He'll continue to not try to escape, because he's already learned to be helpless. He's learned to accept that pain, so he'll continue to do so. If this sounds at all familiar, like maybe you know somebody who kind of demonstrates this pattern of behavior. This pattern of behavior is pretty distinctive, and it can be very, sad to see. But it definitely does seem to be common in humans as well. In fact, a lot of theorists would argue that learned helplessness serves as the basis for depression in most cases. Now, I have a video in the comments just giving another example of learned helplessness. So check that out if you think this is an interesting kind of study. So I just mentioned that depression is a state that's marked by feelings of this kind of helplessness or powerlessness. It's one of the most widespread emotional problems in our country, if not the entire world. And there's some of the most obvious symptoms, some of the most telltale symptoms would be overall loss of appetite or sex drive. It's decreased activity. Like you just don't really want to do much. Things that you used to find fun just aren't fun anymore. And another consequence of that is you just kind of sleep way too much. Like you're always tired. You're always just wanting to lay around and do nothing. And depression is a very serious issue in a lot of students, especially college students, because college students are faced with tons of stressors. And some of those stressors they kind of just learn to become helpless about. They learn to just accept these stressors in their lives, and that can be extremely depressing. To go along with that, a lot of college students, a lot of higher education students, they have just recently moved away from their home, so they might feel isolated. They might feel lonely, and that loneliness definitely amplifies this stress. If they have any kind of difficulty, which is extremely common in school, this could also kind of trigger a depressive episode. Another thing that definitely plays a role is most college students are, either interested in or just kind of defaulted in to the dating scene. So they might have relationship kind of problems, which could also play a major role. So here's just a few ways that you can recognize depression. And you might see these in yourself, or maybe you'll see them in somebody you know. But if you do notice these signs, then I would definitely recommend going or taking that person to a psychiatrist or a counselor or something like that. Like, just don't just pretend like it's not an issue. Don't pretend like it's just gonna fix itself. If somebody needs help, you should get them that help, okay? So here's a few of those signs. So persistently sad or anxious or like empty feelings, feelings of guilt or worthlessness or helplessness, difficulty concentrating, difficulty remembering details, making decisions, even if they're relatively mundane decisions, feeling like pessimistic and hopeless, and once again that loss of interest in activities or hobbies that the person used to enjoy, like even sex. Now, there has been a lot of research into what kinds of things tend to be the most stressful in people's lives. So here I'm going to show you the Social Readjustment Rating Scale, which rates the impact, like the average impact of various life events. So this isn't perfect. This isn't going to perfectly explain how stressed you should be if you feel or if you experience one of these events, but these are just common ratings. So the most stressful thing you can experience on this scale would be the death of a spouse. So that is a stress level of 100. The second most stressful thing that a person can experience is a divorce. That's 73. So there's a huge difference between those two, but those are the two most stressful things. Third would be marital separation at 65, and then jail term at 63, and then finally death of a family member at 63. And after that we have personal injury or illness at 53, and then marriage at 50. Now remember, stress can come from pleasant or unpleasant things. So most of us, well, I hope you as well, would agree that marriage is a good thing. So that would be an example of eustress, Even though something great is happening for you, there's all these different choices that need to be made. So there's all these different sources for stress, and that's why this is one of the most stressful things people can experience. I mentioned earlier in this video that most of our modern stressors are kind of, mundane things. They're little things that really don't warrant the amount of stress that they cause. These are what we would call micro stressors or hassles. Any kind of day-to-day distressing annoyance. And most of us have numerous micro stressors in our lives, and if you start to accumulate a lot of these, if you experience a lot of these on a daily basis, that's going to cause a very significant effect on your psychological and mental health.